So I'm Malia. I live in Richmond, Virginia. Just a little background about me. So I was an attorney in Washington, D.C. I worked for the federal government for 19 years, but I'd always wanted to be a therapist. So that came to a head. I decided to take a risk and have a go back to school for a midlife career change. That was a couple years ago. So I moved to Richmond to enroll at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Social Work. And I graduated in May into the pandemic. So I'm now kind of in limbo. I'm doing a little bit of job searching, also just enjoying a rare opportunity to take some extended time off. Um, so the reason why I wanted to present about personal boundaries is it was a concept that was very instrumental for me personally when I was going through my own personal growth work, psychological healing work, beginning a couple of decades ago, and just working through some of my childhood wounding and my family of origin issues growing up in a dysfunctional family. Um, Unhealthy boundaries are kind of a hallmark of dysfunctional family dynamics. So it was really helpful learning about boundaries and learning how to apply boundaries. Many of you probably are already very familiar with the concepts, so it'll just be a refresher for you. But some people may not have given much thought to personal boundaries. So I am going to go over some basics, and it's always kind of a good idea to refresh our memory on the basics anyway. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a suggestion for strengthening and reinforcing our boundaries, and hopefully I hope to stimulate some interesting discussion and debate for the group breakout sessions and for the group discussion. So in terms of spiral dynamics, my understanding is we start individuating and differentiating and forming personal boundaries at red, kind of coming out of the murky, undifferentiated purple. We start asserting ourselves in red. Unhealthy, that can look kind of violent and aggressive, but we're going to talk about accessing and integrating and using our healthy red tendencies to be assertive in more of an orange kind of way. But this is boundaries, from what I understand, are have a lot to do with red. I'll try to integrate some more spiral dynamics discussion as well as we go along. Um, so, but we're kind of going to be talking about red and orange, and then shifting into relating in terms of green, just in general. So let's start with the definition. Personal boundaries separate and protect our internal self from the external environment. It's that place, that intersection where we interface with others and the world. So, terms of integral theory, we're starting in that upper left quadrant to kind of consider the other quadrants. But the point of power that we can affect change is really that upper left quadrant, the internal self side of things. So in terms of ego development with personal boundaries, the general growth trajectory that we're talking about is going from dependence to independence to interdependence. So in childhood, it's very appropriate, of course, for kids to be a little bit enmeshed with their caregivers, for them to depend upon their caregivers and to learn from external authority, to be dependent. So again, I'm mixing theories. It's not an exact match, but we're kind of talking about some purple, blue meshing with the collective, and then shifting into healthy independence. Around adolescence, kids start to think about their identity. Along with that, often is rebelling against parents. It's just a natural process of individuating, and hopefully parents don't take that personally. They allow the kid to push them away a little bit and start aligning with their peer group. So independence is kind of adolescence and young adulthood, or just adulthood in general, establishing that autonomy and individuating. So healthy red, and I'm imagining orange is kind of the ideal. So as I was preparing this, this presentation, I realized a lot of my assumptions are definitely based on growing up in a Western country, white collar, middle class family. So that's why I'm thinking the culture that most of us are from, orange, individuality, being a good worker, producer, employee is kind of our cultural idea, but obviously that's not across the board. Other cultures are more inherently collectivist. So I just wanted to acknowledge there's some biases here. It's kind of an orange bias. And then when you have that foundation of being a healthy, autonomous individual, you're more open, you're coming from, it's safer from that point of view to then open up, let your boundaries down a little bit, and you have a higher capacity for emotional intimacy and forming relationships that are mutual and balanced and reciprocal. So the trajectory is from the independent autonomy of orange into more of an interdependence collective, this healthy collective attitude of heart-centered attitude of healthy green, just in general. So let's go to some basics. Okay, these are just general principles and guidelines. None of these, by the way, none of these are hard and fast rules, and there always are exceptions. We all really are free to determine our own boundaries. And again, it depends on so many things, including the cultural context, society. But we need to start somewhere. So I just kind of threw together some general principles, but feel free to disagree. And there are always exceptions. And even when you have a healthy sense of boundaries, there's still times when we break, these principles. So just keeping that in mind. So just some general principles from a healthy orange type perspective that I was thinking about is, and again, we're talking about autonomous adults. Different principles apply to children. Again, they're supposed to be dependent on their caregivers. Also, some types of adults are going to remain dependent or become dependent again. Elderly, seniors may be disabled physically or mentally. And also there are adults who have disabilities, emotional, mental, psychological, physical disabilities, that they have to remain in a dependent state. So the presumption is we're talking about autonomous adults. Each adult should determine their own boundaries, limits, and non-negotiables, just as long as they're not infringing upon another person's boundaries. In general, each adult individual is responsible for taking care of their own needs. Each adult should take responsibility for the consequences of their own actions. So as you guys probably know, it's probably obvious, there are different types of boundaries. I'm going to go over these kind of quickly. They're kind of obvious. So I'm going to go over some physical boundaries, mental boundaries, emotional boundaries. There are other types of boundaries, spiritual boundaries. but I'm just sticking to these three for now. So physical boundaries, an adult has the right to make decisions regarding bodily autonomy, safety, and privacy. Of course, whether to accept or decline physical touch or affection, in a romantic or sexual context or even platonic context. Just a tap on the arm, you should have the right to decline. So we have the right to make decisions regarding physical health, nutrition, hygiene, medical interventions, and regarding our personal possessions. So just a few examples of violations of these boundaries. Obviously, for being touched without consent, obviously in extremes like battery or physical abuse, having our property stolen or vandalized, invasion of personal space. I was kind of laughing at this because during the COVID era, 6 feet social distancing, hopefully we don't have to worry about that as much, but this is kind of non-COVID norms when people stand a little bit too close to us. Again, that's cultural. Different cultures have a different standard of personal space, as well as different situations do as well. Mental boundaries, some examples. An adult has a right to determine their own beliefs and worldviews, morals, values, and personal codes of ethics, think their own thoughts. And of course, a big one is we should be able to decide when to say yes, when to say no to a request, and consent or decline as we choose. And everyone has a right to decide whether, when, and with whom we want to share our thoughts and our points of view. That's up to us, obviously. So some examples of violations. Obviously, the big one is if we tell someone no and they override that, or they try to make excessive attempts to persuade us to say yes. That's a big red flag. Sharing a confidence. If we try to make decisions on behalf of another autonomous adult without their permission, lying or gaslighting another, these are kind of from the point of view of the perpetrator. Also, there's some subtle violations. They weren't obvious to me at first. I've done this many times, giving unsolicited advice when it's not really appropriate. And I was thinking sometimes even just judging other people or being judgmental, maybe sometimes that's kind of depends on the circumstances, but maybe that's a little bit of a subtle violation of their mental boundaries. Sometimes it's all depends on the context. Okay, emotional boundaries. We all have the right to feel our feelings, define them, interpret them as we see fit. We all have the right to express our emotions as we see fit, and as appropriate to the context. Again, but hopefully not in a way that it infringes upon another person's boundaries. I put that under expression because sometimes our expression of emotion can be very uncomfortable or not appropriate to another person. And examples of violations of emotional boundaries: invalidating someone's feelings, manipulating another person's feelings, projecting our emotions onto another, or making assumptions about how another person's feeling before asking them. So a metaphor that I like to think of is a cell membrane. So a healthy cell membrane can distinguish between the cell contents that belong in the cell, like the nucleus, the cytoplasm, and what should stay outside of the cell. The lymph that circulates around delivers nutrients. It should be permeable, allow nutrients in and waste products to exit, and it should maintain homeostasis. Okay, I'm about halfway through. I'm kind of rushing. I may have bitten off more than I could chew. So healthy personal boundaries, like a healthy cell membrane, they're well differentiated. They can discriminate between what's me, what's not me, what's mine, what's not mine. Um, and they're permeable, they're flexible, and they protect the self from mistreatment and abuse by unsafe others, which I'll get to in a moment, and allow us to be vulnerable and emotionally intimate with safe others. And I'll get to those terms in a minute. So basically, the role of our personal boundaries is to discern where I stop and another begins. What's me and what's not me. Okay. So I don't, so in the realm of boundaries, there's this concept of safe others versus unsafe others. That the term is is a little uncomfortable for me. It sounds kind of judgmental. So this just means for the individual. For me, some people have been safe and some people have been less safe. It doesn't mean that the unsafe people are bad people, and other people may not experience them as unsafe. But I found that these individuals have violated my boundaries in the past. I felt uncomfortable around them. They've invalidated me, or whatever your criteria would be. Um, so, for lack of a better term, we'll call them unsafe. So, obviously, a safe individual, someone who honors our boundaries, we can kind of relax around them. We can let down our guard around these individuals. And unsafe others they don't respect our boundaries, and so we should remain guarded around them. So let's see. I had a little bit more on that. So the importance of distinguishing is because our boundaries are going to be flexible throughout the day. And we're going to be raising and lowering our guard. So you want to think in terms of the situation you're in, um, the workplace, you're on the phone with a client, you want pretty firm professional boundaries. Maybe you're going to lunch with a good friend, you trust this person, they're a safe person. You can let down your guard, relax. You can confide personal information to this person. You don't have to worry that they're going to gossip about you or whatever. Um, Home, relaxing with your spouse, you can, hopefully that's a safe person and you could just be yourself. But then maybe, you know, someone in your family calls you, they're kind of a gossip, or they're kind of a mean person, and then you want to put your guard, you want to reinforce your boundaries again. And um that's someone who you probably don't want to share something vulnerable and personal with, someone who's gossipy, or someone who is going to mock you, or they're not a trustworthy person. So that's just what's meant by safe versus unsafe people. It's just for the purposes of determining what level of boundaries you want to have when you interact with that person. um obvious Obviously, um, another point about a safe person, as much as possible, they're going to be clear and direct in their communication. They're not going to be expecting you to read. In general, again, no one is perfect. So I'm kind of talking about an ideal healthy person with healthy boundaries, who's like a unicorn out there, not rarely does this person exist or do we encounter this person, but it's just kind of an ideal. This person communicates directly, uses nonviolent communication, listens to you, doesn't invalidate your emotions, um, doesn't make assumptions about what you're thinking and feeling, and doesn't expect you to read their mind, doesn't give you the silent treatment, that kind of thing. So just generally a healthy psychological person, but no one is perfect. And unsafe person is the opposite, as you can imagine. They violate your boundaries, they invalidate your emotions. And in particular, if you tell them no, you if someone doesn't accept that no means no, and they just try to persuade you to change your mind excessively, that person is not respecting your boundaries and it's not being safe. Okay. So, um, so that's healthy boundaries. Unhealthy boundaries are often, so there are two extremes. Enmeshment, so in the collective V means there's kind of a risk that we might be a bit codependent and enmeshed. Our thoughts and feelings get all kind of confused with someone else's thoughts and feelings, and it's hard to know what's mine and what's not mine. There's that overlap. So we want these overlapping circles, we want fully intact, separate circles with some space in between is what healthy boundaries look like. And we interact and negotiate and communicate in that space between the two fully intact circles, not these overlapping circles. Then in the more self-oriented V means, is that maybe the left side of the spiral? Okay. The red and orange and what have you, the risk is maybe of being too independent, which can become a bit alienating. The boundary might be too rigid. So, of course, there is that overarching theme in spiral dynamics. I'm very new to it, so forgive me if I'm not using the right terms, but I was thinking about the spiral as a whole, especially tier one. It is all about the spiral turning from the left to the right is all about our boundaries expanding and contracting. We focus on the self, and then we expand into the collective, and then we focus and the overall trajectory is towards becoming more and more expanded and widening our circle of concern and what's me. And ultimately, I'm a student of non-duality, so ultimately I don't believe there are real boundaries or there's no real separation between us, but still, we're functioning in these human bodies and with our own minds and psychological neuroses. And so at that psychological, mental, emotional, physical level, it's still helpful to speak in terms of boundaries, even when we've experienced or we study non-duality. Okay, so I have about 7 minutes left. So what I kind of recommend, especially if if you've never really explored this topic before, or if you're wondering, if maybe you have some issues with enmeshment or codependency, but even if you're an expert on boundaries and you've been doing this a long time, it could still be helpful to go back and have a refresher and reinforce our boundaries. So what I like to do is, or what's often recommended is to have a visualization of what your boundaries are like, and do this for a day or two. It's not a permanent thing, because once you do this consciously, it eventually becomes second nature and it's automatic. And some people may already you may be sensitive enough and your instincts may already be good enough, or you might be psychologically healthy enough or fortunate to have not grown up in a dysfunctional family that you are automatically and instinctively are adjusting your boundaries throughout the day, and you're very clear about boundaries. But for most of us, it could be a good idea when we're to be conscious about this, practice this for a while until it does become automatic. So use your imagination to visualize your personal boundary. It's up to you how you want to do this. At my student internship this year, I was a therapist for children who had experienced interpersonal trauma, and we teach them about boundaries by giving them a hula hoop. So they put the hula hoop around them, and then they have a concrete representation of their personal space. So you can visualize something like that. That's kind of a cast a circle. That's a bit woo woo, but you can, visualize like a 2D circle, or it's probably more effective to kind of give it a 3D component, a bubble or an egg. And if you do energy work, you may have encountered, auras. And if you want to get more sophisticated, you could fill your egg with white light or love, or, whatever you want to do. That might be too woo woo for some people, I understand. But so try this one day where, maybe in the morning you visualize your boundary, and then as you consciously interact with other people and you go about your day, think about the context and the appropriate level of reinforcement, and also that concept of safe people versus unsafe people, and raise raise and lower your shield as appropriate to the context. So you can expand or contract the size of your circle or your bubble, or you could imagine raising or lowering the protective shield. And, if you're sometimes in my past, I've had bosses. The workplace can be such a tough place to maintain boundaries because, there are consequences. You can't always just leave an employment situation because of salary. So I was an attorney in DC. So that is actually the metropolitan area with the highest number of personality disorders, as it turns out. And it was the legal profession. So um, I had a fair number of bully bosses. So in those situations, I would really work on reinforcing like a shield before going into a meeting. And, I would shift from like a gossamer porous substance and imagine like a metal shield. So, and of course, I hope it's clear, but the idea of shifting and changing our boundaries in a conscious way is to maintain that balance between protecting ourselves, the vulnerable side of ourselves, and then being intimate and letting our vulnerable, playful inner child come out. When we're around a safe person, who's capable of emotional intimacy, we can lower our guard and get our emotional needs met. But it's not a good idea to expose your vulnerable inner child to an abusive bully. So then we're gonna put up our metal shield, or reinforce our boundary to have that balance between protection versus intimacy. Okay, so I have like 1 more minute left, but just some more thoughts. I kind of have already gone over this. I wanted to incorporate a little more spiral dynamics from my very novice point of view, and just thinking of some of the boundary issues. Purple has issues with lack of differentiation and like a murky, ambiguous self. As we already said, red is about starting to define the self and set boundaries, but there's also a need to control the violent and aggressive impulses. And then blue, there could be some enmeshment. I came from like a religious background where there's a lot of issues with martyrdom and turning the other cheek that I had to learn to overcome. Sacrificing yourself for the good of others was something I kind of had to unlearn. And there's some judginess often in blue, and just kind of being subordinate to external authority. So orange, we're gonna have a healthier expression of boundaries. We're going to own our own internal authority, but then that could go too far. We could be a bit domineering, and then we're maybe alienating ourselves from others and maybe sacrificing intimacy in favor of autonomy. So we resolve that through green, but then there's again that issue we experience on the collective side of maybe being a bit too codependent or dependent on others.